Scott Horton begins by tracing the origins of the conflict between the United States and Iran back to the 1953 CIA-backed coup against Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh. This event saw the reinstatement of the Shah, Reza Pahlavi, a monarch whose rule was marked by authoritarianism and repression. Horton highlights a declassified CIA history by Donald Wilbur, which coined the term blowback to describe the unintended long-term consequences of covert foreign interventions like this coup. The American public, largely unaware of these secret policies, is left vulnerable to misleading narratives about subsequent events. The coup planted deep resentment in Iran, which culminated in the 1979 Iranian Revolution. Horton emphasizes that the revolution was a popular uprising against the Shah's oppressive regime, which was propped up by the U.S. and heavily militarized with American weapons. The Shah's inability to sustain his rule, partly due to economic strain from excessive military spending encouraged by Nixon's administration, set the stage for the revolution. The U.S. government's misreading of the Ayatollah Khomeini as a potentially moderate figure based on flawed intelligence and diplomatic advice further complicated relations and contributed to the hostage crisis later that year. The 1979 revolution was initially met with cautious engagement by the U.S. government, which maintained contact with the new regime and even warned it about regional threats, including Saddam Hussein's ambitions in Iraq. However, the situation deteriorated when David Rockefeller intervened to allow the Shah into the United States for cancer treatment. This move was interpreted by many Iranians as a sign that the U.S. intended to reinstate the Shah, sparking the embassy hostage crisis. Horton explains that the embassy, a symbol of American covert operations dating back to the 1953 coup, was attacked and seized by revolutionaries. The crisis lasted 444 days and was a pivotal moment in U.S. Iran relations. The failed rescue attempt, Operation Eagle Claw, was a disaster that further humiliated the U.S. and led to the Carter Doctrine, which declared the Persian Gulf an American lake and warned the Soviet Union against any attempts to dominate the region. This doctrine marked a significant escalation in U.S. military commitment to the Middle East. Horton situates the Iranian conflict within the broader Cold War context, particularly the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. He details how the Carter administration, under the influence of Zbigniew Brzezinski, authorized the CIA to support the Afghan Mujahideen as a way to bait the Soviets into a costly quagmire, reminiscent of America's own Vietnam experience. This proxy war was designed to stretch Soviet resources thin and ultimately contributed to the USSR's collapse. The U.S. collaboration with Saudi Arabia and Pakistan in supporting Islamist fighters in Afghanistan had unintended consequences. Many of these fighters, including Arabs and other foreign volunteers, would later form the core of al-Qaeda. Horton notes that this strategy was a form of brinkmanship, exploiting the Soviets' vulnerabilities but sowing the seeds for future conflicts involving Islamist militants who would turn against the U.S. The Iran-Iraq War, which began in 1980, was another critical chapter in the region's turmoil. Horton explains that the U.S. effectively gave Saddam Hussein a green light to invade Iran, motivated by fears of the spread of the Iranian Revolution and the destabilization of the region. Saddam's regime, a Sunni minority ruling over a Shiite majority, feared internal rebellion inspired by Iran's revolution. During the 8-year conflict, the U.S. supported Iraq with intelligence and even chemical weapons, despite the horrific human cost. Horton highlights the hypocrisy of the U.S. government, which later used Iraq's chemical weapons program as a justification for the 2003 invasion, despite having facilitated it during the 1980s. The war solidified the Iranian regime's power as the population rallied around the government in the face of external aggression. Horton provides a detailed account of the 1990 to 1991 Gulf War, emphasizing the complex and often contradictory U.S. policies that led to the conflict. He discusses how mixed signals from U.S. officials encouraged Saddam Hussein to invade Kuwait, only for the U.S. to respond with overwhelming military force. The war was framed as a humanitarian mission to protect Kuwaitis, but Horton exposes the fabricated atrocities, such as the incubator baby story, used to justify intervention. After the war, the U.S. encouraged a Shiite uprising against Saddam, only to abandon the rebels and allow Saddam to brutally suppress them. This betrayal entrenched U.S. military presence in the region under the guise of protecting vulnerable populations, setting the stage for future conflicts. Horton critiques the war as a missed opportunity for genuine regional stability and a precursor to the 2003 invasion. The podcast delves into the emergence of al-Qaeda and the series of terrorist attacks against U.S. interests throughout the 1990s. Horton outlines how the U.S. government, particularly under Bill Clinton, simultaneously supported Islamist militants in various conflicts while failing to adequately address the growing threat they posed. He highlights FBI and CIA failures to prevent attacks such as the 1993 World Trade Center bombing and the 1998 embassy bombings in Africa. Horton also discusses the complex relationship between the U.S. and Islamist groups, noting that some factions were seen as useful proxies against Soviet influence or regional adversaries. This contradictory policy allowed al-Qaeda to grow stronger and more capable, culminating in the 9/11 attacks. The podcast underscores the tragic irony of supporting groups that would later become America's deadliest enemies. A significant portion of the discussion focuses on the neoconservative movement, its origins, and its influence on U.S. foreign policy. Horton traces the neocons' roots to former leftists and Trotskyites who shifted rightward during the Cold War, becoming ardent advocates for aggressive American interventionism. He explains how this group, often closely tied to Israel and the military-industrial complex, dominated conservative thought and pushed for wars in the Middle East. Horton details the neocons' role in shaping the Iraq War and their broader agenda to reshape the Middle East in ways that would serve Israeli and American strategic interests. He stresses that while the neocons are often conflated with all hawks, they represent a specific ideological faction with a distinct history and agenda. Their influence led to a series of disastrous wars and policies that continue to destabilize the region. The 2003 invasion of Iraq is examined as a culmination of neoconservative ambitions and flawed intelligence. Horton explains how the war was justified by false claims about weapons of mass destruction and ties between Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda, largely fabricated by neocon operatives within the U.S. government. The invasion empowered Shiite factions aligned with Iran, contrary to the neocons' expectations. Horton highlights the brutal aftermath, including the sectarian violence and the empowerment of Iranian-backed militias. The war also led to the rise of the Islamic State, as Sunni insurgents reacted to the new political order. The podcast critiques the war as a strategic blunder that weakened U.S. influence and exacerbated regional instability, while also betraying the promises made to various Iraqi factions. The discussion turns to the Syrian civil war, which Horton characterizes as a foreign invasion facilitated by the U.S., Turkey, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar through support for Islamist militant groups, including al-Qaeda affiliates. He argues that the war was not a genuine popular uprising, but a proxy conflict aimed at undermining the Assad regime, which is allied with Iran and Hezbollah. Horton critiques the U.S. media and political establishment for demonizing Assad while ignoring the atrocities committed by the Islamist rebels. He notes the tragic consequences for Syria's ancient Christian communities and the broader humanitarian disaster. The podcast also touches on the political persecution of figures like Tulsi Gabbard, who opposed U.S. support for these militants, illustrating the suppression of dissenting views on the conflict. Horton provides a nuanced analysis of Iran's nuclear program, dispelling myths about secret weapons development. He explains that Iran's nuclear activities have largely been transparent and compliant with international agreements, including the Non-Proliferation Treaty and safeguards with the IAEA. The program is described as a latent deterrent, with Iran mastering uranium enrichment but not actively pursuing nuclear weapons. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, or Iran nuclear deal, is presented as a successful effort to limit Iran's nuclear capabilities and prevent war. Horton argues that the deal was designed to prevent Israeli and U.S. military action and that its abandonment by the Trump administration led to renewed tensions and Iranian escalation. He critiques hawkish politicians for exaggerating the threat and pushing for conflict based on false premises. Throughout the conversation, Horton emphasizes the outsized influence of Israel and its lobby on U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. He discusses how Israeli strategic interests, particularly opposition to Iran and the desire to maintain dominance in the region, have shaped American actions, often at the expense of U.S. national interests. This includes support for regime change, military interventions, and backing of militant groups hostile to Iran and its allies. Horton points out that this alignment has led to policies that are detrimental both to the United States and to Israel itself, fostering instability and conflict. He stresses that many decisions are driven by the priorities of foreign powers rather than American security or prosperity, contributing to the cycle of war and blowback. In closing, Horton reflects on the prospects for a shift in U.S. foreign policy away from endless wars and empire building. He expresses cautious hope that growing public opposition, particularly among veterans and conservative Americans, could force a retrenchment and a focus on domestic priorities. Horton highlights movements like Defend the Guard that seek to limit the deployment of National Guard troops abroad without congressional approval. He envisions a future where America embraces a more restrained, America-first approach, reducing military interventions and fostering peaceful relations with global powers, including Russia and China. Horton underscores the importance of honest historical understanding and public awareness in achieving this change, advocating for transparency and accountability in foreign policy decisions.